Food chains and webs. What's for dinner? Every organism needs to obtain energy in order to live. For example, plants get energy from the sun. Some animals eat plants, and some animals eat other animals. A food chain is the sequence of who eats whom in an ecosystem to obtain nutrition. A food chain starts with the primary energy source, usually the sun. The next link in the chain is an organism that makes its own food from the primary energy source. An example is photosynthetic plants that make their own food from sunlight using a process called photosynthesis. These are called autotrophs or primary producers. Next come organisms that eat the autotrophs. These organisms are called herbivores or primary consumers. An example is a grasshopper that eats grass. The next link in the chain is animals that eat herbivores. These are called secondary consumers. An example is a frog that eats grasshoppers. In turn, these animals are eaten by larger predators. An example is a snake that eats frogs. The tertiary consumers are eaten by quaternary consumers. An example is an eagle that eats snakes. Each food chain ends with a top predator or apex predator, an animal with no natural enemies, like an alligator, hawk, or polar bear. So if we look at the food chain, we see that we have our producer is the grass, our primary consumer is the grasshopper, our secondary consumer is the frog, the python is the tertiary consumer, and the eagle is the quaternary consumer. The arrows in a food chain show the flow of energy from the sun to a top predator. As the energy flows from organism to organism, energy is lost at each step. So if you look, you have an arrow. The arrow represents the direction of the energy flow. So the energy from the grass goes into the grasshopper. The energy from the grasshopper goes into the frog. The energy from the frog goes into the python, and the energy from the python goes into the eagle. So the arrow points in the direction of the energy flow, or I always think it points to the stomach that the food is going into. Trophic levels. The trophic level of an organism is the position it holds on a food chain. So when we talk about a trophic level, it's just like identifying, is it a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, so on. So just to reiterate the vocabulary, a primary producer is the organisms that make their own food from sunlight, and they're the base of every food chain. So they're what starts the food chain. These organisms are called autotrophs. Primary consumers are animals that eat the producers, and these are generally the herbivores, the plant eaters. A secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, and these are the carnivores or omnivores. A carnivore is an organism that eats animals, and an omnivore eats both plants and animals. The tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers, and the quaternary consumers eat the tertiary consumers, and they can go on from there. So the food chain ends with whatever is the top or apex predator, and these are animals that have little or no natural enemies. A network of many food chains is called a food web. So if we look at this food web, there are several arrows pointing into organisms. So some organisms have more than one arrow going into them, which means that they can consume more than one animal. When any organism dies, it is eventually eaten by detrivores. This would be the vultures, worms, and crabs, and are broken down by the decomposers, mostly bacteria and fungi like mushrooms, and the exchange of energy continues. Some organisms' position in the food chain can vary as their diet differs. For example, when a bear eats berries, the bear is functioning as a primary consumer. When a bear eats a plant-eating rodent, the bear is functioning as a secondary consumer. When the bear eats salmon, the bear is functioning as a tertiary consumer. This is because salmon is a secondary consumer, since salmon eat herring that eat zooplankton that eat phytoplankton that make their own energy from sunlight. Think about how people's place in the food chain varies, often within a single meal. The energy pyramid. Each trophic level only has 10% of its energy available to pass on. The diagram below shows that the producer level has 100% of energy. It can make its own food. The primary consumer only has 10%, the secondary has 1%, and the tertiary would only have 0.1%. So if we think about the transfer of energy, at the base of the pyramid, it's the widest. They have 100% of their energy available because, again, they can make their own energy. The grasshopper has to expend some energy as heat in order to get the grass. The frog has to expend even more energy to catch the grasshopper. And the snake has to kind of hunt and pursue the frog, so it uses a lot of its energy. So that means there's less energy available from that organism. So as you move up from the base of the pyramid to the top, you see we get to the smaller point. That's why there's less energy available at the top. So remember that the food web food chain is all about energy transfer, how we take energy from the sun and we transfer that energy from organism to organism in order to survive.